Welcome to our mini lecturette on elder abuse, definitions, theories, and where to go from here. We will be following along the PowerPoint presentation which has been posted on the University of Toronto's website. This first section will go up to the slide entitled The Power and Control Wheel. The first slide talks about older Canadians' values, and it says, "Are these yours?" In a study in 1998, it was found that key social and cultural values of seniors included dignity, fairness, participation, and security. But overwhelmingly, the most important value for seniors was independence. What I would offer is, in Canada, independence is certainly a right, but it does require, like anything else, people to be there to help defend and enforce that right, particularly in a society which is rife with ageism. And as we know, older Canadians are living ever more in a society where there are cuts to the systems, or alternatively, proper investment has not necessarily been made for the very systems that would work best. So while we are discussing the concepts of elder abuse and neglect, I think it's important that we keep in mind those 5 values of dignity, fairness, participation, and security, but overwhelmingly the need for independence and our role in supporting the defense and enforcement of those values. The next slide talks about some statistics, and many of you may have heard a number of statistics on elder abuse in the past. We know that in Canada, between about 4 and 10% of older adults are victims of abuse and neglect. Overwhelmingly, the study indicates that financial abuse is a key form of abuse of seniors, and that it is likely to be markedly on the rise, particularly in an area of recession and intergenerational transfers of wealth, when our boomer population is quite indebted and their adults, who at this point, their parents, often in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, have been savers and not spenders. When we look at statistics with regards to elder abuse, it's important to know a few things. The first is that elder abuse is wildly underreported, and there are a number of good reasons for that. It's very rare that people are willing to discuss forms of abuse, and indeed, many victims themselves may not actually be aware that they have been abused. This can be particularly difficult in terms of reporting when abusers are overwhelmingly family and friends. So there are all kinds of barriers to reporting abuse, including shame, concern, lack of awareness, and perhaps challenges to capacity, which builds upon our work from the previous. The next slide looks at misconceptions, as we call them. And as we scroll through, you can see that there's some really very common misconceptions in Canada. One of the things that you'll hear constantly in the news media is that old people cost the system too much, or that they don't contribute to society. We hear terms like bed blockers or they're complainers. Recently I heard quite a lot of feedback from an article of Margaret Wentes where she was calling people geezers and how they weren't necessarily being helpful to society. And it's important that as we move through our discussions about elder abuse and neglect, that we are aware that the context that we're moving in is one which has ageist misconceptions and sometimes just a complete misunderstanding about the role of seniors in society. Indicated here that they may not have new relationships or that they're mostly demented. What we know is that older adults have a number of key relationships, and indeed one of the growing areas is dating in senior years. And we also know that statistically most seniors will not become demented, but what we know is most people who have dementia are seniors. So it works one way but not the next. So overwhelmingly, as we move forward, it is important that we keep these common misconceptions in mind. What we know is, yes, it's true that the highest users of the healthcare system are people in their last year of life. But the last year of life does not necessarily mean that they're seniors. We do also know that seniors do cost the healthcare system markedly in the 80s, but what we don't hear about is all of the years that they've paid into the healthcare system overall. We know that seniors overwhelmingly are the volunteers in society, and that's something like 72% of all seniors volunteer, and that's not necessarily the case of our baby boomer population. In terms of childcare hours, the numbers are astronomical, and our caregiving hours, which you've also seen in some of the previous materials, are such that the Canadian population and the economy could not work without seniors. And those are just the ones in retirement, not at all discussing the fact that many, many seniors continue to work and pay into the Canadian society. I'm going to introduce the concept of elder abuse in this mini lecture and then move to our next video. The concept of what is elder abuse is probably a conversation you've had in your practice at some point. And there are many different definitions of elder abuse depending on the context that it's used. But it is often defined as an action or inaction by an individual that results in harm to an older person. Now, the concept of trust is often infused in this, but there's an active debate about whether or not elder abuse requires a trust relationship. So some of the older definitions that you see at the World Health Organizations have people being in a position of trust. In Canada, we have variously adopted the notion of requiring trust and not requiring trust. So you see in the green bullet number 2, the concept of trust is not necessarily infused in that. So it's an action or inaction by an individual that results in harm to an older person. The concept of trust is, however, in the third bullet point, where it indicates that abusers may be family members, friends, caregivers, people in positions of trust or power. They can be strangers, and stranger fraud targeting seniors is a form of senior abuse as well. Neglect is usually defined as a failure of somebody to provide needed assistance, which can include both goods and services. And self-neglect is, in a sense, the cousin to these issues, but is not necessarily the same issue. Self-neglect is the failure of an older person to adequately care for him or herself. So abuse and neglect speak about somebody else doing it. Self-neglect is a little bit different and often requires a greater understanding about the older adult themselves and what's happening. This may include refusing assistance from others. It may indicate physical limitations. It may indicate cognitive difficulties, but it's not the same as elder abuse. So when we're looking at self-neglect, we really have to mine down a little bit more and find out what are some of the underlying issues. We're going to close at the slide indicating the 8 underlying theories of abuse and neglect, and at this point move to our next mini lecture. Thank you.